What do you do when you lose a friend? What do you do when all you can do is notice the places they've been? This is where she cooked the strangest dishes I've ever seen. This is where she slept. This is where she did her makeup. This is where she smoked crack. On November 12th, 2021, my friend Jeslyn Stelmack died of an overdose. She had been struggling with addiction for as long as I had known her. I heard about it in my kitchen over Instagram DMs. Immediately, I told everyone I knew who knew her. The first post I saw didn't say that she had died, just an expression of sadness, but somehow I knew. She always joked that she'd be dead by 22. Every bender she went on, that same phrase would justify the next drink or the next hit. It's almost hard to not romanticize. She was a shooting star, burning with bizarre intensity. Every show she went to, every quirky phrase, she was unapologetically herself, and it was a joy to be around. She was my guide through the city of Worcester, and she was good at it. If I hadn't met her, I would have never learned about Worcester's music scene and all the joys that these gloriously harsh sounds have to offer. I certainly wouldn't be half the guitarist I am today. Grieving has been a strange process. She was a conflicted person, but her beauty shined through in the art and music she created. What was once an old collage made of trash she found by 7-Eleven is now a priceless keepsake. I speak as if I was her closest friend, and while I do like to think I knew her well, especially towards the end of her life, I was far from her only friend. Her passing affected many people throughout Massachusetts and beyond. I had the pleasure of meeting Jez at Clark University, where she and I went to school until she dropped out in our sophomore year, around the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. I didn't have much contact with her until around the end of 2020, when she came to stay with my roommate Jacob and I for a few weeks.
Well, we met her our freshman year, so about 4 years ago. She was always like a stoner and drinker and smoked cigs and did, psychs and etc. And it was always just like, wild child, college shit. By sophomore year, we saw that, Jez wasn't really being herself and was getting more and more hooked on, I remember drinking and then was smoking weed like it was cigarettes. I remember she moved away to Amherst and dropped out of school, and we were like, oh, that'll be great for her. And it was for the time being, but that was just sort of when it progressed further into harder drugs and living a life that allowed for doing drugs. There were only a handful of times that when she was here, living with us, that we saw moments where she resented that sort of life. But for such a long time, it was this is what she wanted to be doing. So much of it was just out of our control and out of the realm of possibility and opportunity. She went to residencies and sobriety places, and they weren't good. It was always bittersweet when she left a place that she was getting treatment for, because you knew that she needed to be in a place like that to be getting help, but if it wasn't helping her, then she had to get out and find another place. I loved seeing Jez get to know herself and come out and have her personality and grow, but it was like tarnished a little bit by the addiction. As tough as it was, I cherish it because I cherish her and I miss her. It was a shooting star or a meteor hitting a planet, and it was brutal and deadly and depressing, but I'll always like remember her and look up to her and admire the experience and being able to witness her grow into what she was, into herself, as much of herself as she was able to be.
A few months before she passed, Jez posted something on her Instagram story. She said, "If I OD, dump my body on the State House steps." When she passed, the energy of that anger passed on to me. It was a radicalizing force. To be ignorant of the brutalizing effects of addiction was a privilege, but it had been stripped from me. My grieving process was moving right along. I've always struggled with difficult emotions, and work has always been a way to process things, so I got to writing emails. I reached out to anyone who I thought could offer a perspective: city government, the medical field, and to the community itself.
Well, Worcester is one of the places in the state where the bottom falls out, where our social safety net is tested the hardest, and where we see it fail.
You know, right now we're in this opioid epidemic that has continues to progressively worsen, especially in the midst of this COVID pandemic, which has caused increased stress, anxiety, leading to depression, and obviously, contributing to a lot of poor social determinants, people being evicted, people being forced into homelessness or housing insecurity, which tends to can potentially drive people to using substances.
There's no question that I think homelessness in and of itself is a very complex issue. There isn't one single issue that leads to somebody experiencing homelessness. So addiction is one of those prisms, right?
It is, it's a problem that needs a lot more funding than it's getting.
We don't, as a state, invest in addiction treatment.
There are opportunities for treatment available, but they're hard to get into, especially if you've, say, been in and out of prison and you don't have proper identification or a good point of contact to receive social services.
The system is so convoluted and it's so complicated. And I think, unfortunately, individuals come out of these sort of detox, whatever you want to call them, detoxes, rehab. They come out of it, tend to come out of these programs without appropriate plans in place.
A lot of the times, people with addiction problems have such a bad taste in their mouth after constant bad interactions with homeless shelters, with the police, with social services, that they'd rather just live in the woods.
The approach that we take in the city through the Department of Public Health is very limited by virtue of how many resources they have.
The Public Health Office in Worcester has a quality of life team that's run by a former police officer that is caseworkers and public health people and homeless outreach people with the help of the police, so they kind of work hand in hand. And what they do is they go into homeless encampments and try to offer what services they can to homeless people, and which is oftentimes addiction services or housing vouchers to get people into housing. But what ends up happening is a lot of people don't take the city up on those services.
A lot of folks will go into sort of the treatment system because there is an urgent need at that moment. So maybe a lot of individuals with substance use disorders tend to be housing insecure.
In no way, shape, or form, as a local government, this should be our burden, but it becomes our burden.
Your personal familial social safety net collapses, and then you fall into the state social safety net, which is very thin. Yeah. And Worcester is one of the places where that safety net finally collapses.
These programs tend to be very, very strict and unfortunately try to find any sort of excuse to get rid of, or to kick out, these individuals that may have sort of, sort of complex sort of attitudes or personalities or whatever.
The treatment system was developed sort of long ago. It wasn't developed for opioid use disorder. So, for example, detox, from my understanding, was developed more to treat the acute symptoms of alcohol withdrawal.
Folks who are struggling in this well of homelessness, addiction, and poverty, racism, and all sorts of other isms, even the smallest setback can turn them, can bring them back to where they started.
So it's hard to kind of get people into the right doors. And as Ricky was saying too, it's, people that come with complexity and trauma and all types of different things. And, there's been a lot of focus on trying to evolve the treatment system to address trauma, because people come in and they might have lots of barriers in the way for them engaging in care. And if the treatment system is looking for a reason to, exclude them from that care, someone with a history of trauma is going to give a reason pretty quickly.
Shelters are not a solution. I say that as somebody who's sitting in one. And so we can create more individual shelters, but they're unsafe for a lot of people. They don't provide holistic services. Sometimes they're run by volunteers who may not have the training, the trauma training, or the substance addiction training, or the ability to figure out the complex world of navigating housing, period.
What they're finding too is, just providing someone a roof over their head isn't necessarily meeting their needs. And also they're using with a group of people. So those are their trusted, their trusted family, friends, that are surrounding them. And when you are assisting someone in sort of seeking out recovery, you're basically asking them to leave their entire life of what they feel trusted and, supported by, and then moving into this different environment, which is scary. The treatment system is continuing to evolve, but it can't evolve fast enough.
It's entirely understandable to feel lost, directionless, and like it's impossible to really make something of yourself in our world. And drugs offer a way out of that.
It's very easy to say that the city and the nonprofit sectors are not doing the right thing. I think they are.
I think that the expectation that people will achieve recovery, or whoever's concept of recovery it is, that people will achieve recovery initially or the first time is not realistic and is not seen with any other medical care out there.
A lot of our economic development policies do not support this kind of measure that works. And so what that means is that yes, we might create units for chronically homeless individuals, but that doesn't take away, it doesn't resolve the issue of how rents are increasing and rendering new people homeless or on the verge of experiencing homelessness. It doesn't address the fact that cash investors, into something that I've testified on, are swooping into this hot market, buying properties, selling them, increasing rents, and potentially not potentially, but actually they are displacing people. And so we tend to look at a very narrow set of issues, and we come up with a very narrow set of solutions.
And no amount of public health resources directed at, any of the ideas we have, like supervised injection sites or temporary supportive housing, or converting hotels into ad hoc homeless shelters in the winter. None of that is going to address the root problem of just like the psychological carnage of our society.
We have to meet individuals where they're at that time period. If they're not ready for being in stable housing, if they're not ready for being in recovery, we can't. There's a lot of things we can do rather than just saying, okay, you said thanks, but no thanks. We're gonna leave. And I think that's where the whole harm reduction sort of movement comes into play. We have a long ways to go, and unfortunately, a lot of people are going to succumb to this before there's any strides made. There's a lot of things that need to be done. Obviously, policy change, decriminalization of substance use, destigmatization of substance use. This all contributes to worsening outcomes. Doing it in a trauma-informed fashion, providing care in a trauma-informed fashion, and then like sort of taking a step back and like thinking like substance use treatment is not only dependent on medications. We have to like address everything. We got to meet the patients where they're at. We got to do it in a trauma-informed fashion. But then if that's not what the patient wants, there has to be harm reduction.
Yeah, I definitely think we have a long way to go in terms of changing hearts and minds, especially as it comes to the stigma that homelessness carries with it. And probably the unsheltered folks are in the forefront of receiving the stigma and backlash because they're visible. Families who experience homelessness are invisible. The ones that are housing insecure are invisible because they're hiding, so to speak, behind couch surfing or overcrowding. And so specifically for chronically homeless individuals that we see are visible to society, I don't think things are changing. We have ways to go before we change hearts and minds. And I think part of it is that people are very not educated, and maybe there's an unwillingness to learn about how complex how the complexity that homelessness brings with it, right? So if you are accepting that addiction is not a happens today, we resolve it tomorrow journey, it means that we have to be patient.
Yeah, and I guess at the stage of that game, and individuals who you're seeing that are mass cast or on the streets, they're not, like Lisa mentioned, they're not having fun. They're not getting high. They're basically they're using substances to feel normal.
They're trying to feel normal. It's hard to fault anyone for that. In a world that places so much pressure on conformity, it's ironic to think that this desperate grasp for normalcy is a punishable crime. Jessalyn was not normal. That's what I loved about her. Policies can change, but hearts need to change too. How do you look at the man begging for money on the corner, or the woman passed out on the bus stop? It might matter more than you think.